the top of the massive screen set before them. On it, a clock with golden numbers was slowly counting down toward 0. There were several hours remaining, yet second by second the time was falling away, as all time was wont to do. Every person in the room already knew what would happen when time ran out, just as they had when the clock was silver in color and counting down on the prior day. The clock signaled the time remaining until the difficulty was going to be kicked up, when the next level of enemy would be released into the field. Gold Cord robots were hours from entry, and when the time for their entrance came, it would mark a real turning point in the training exercise. Gold Cord robots were powerful enough that they could, and had, killed full members of the guild before. If an apprentice went against one unprepared, the class might just get a little bit smaller. This is it. Beverly gestured to the cave, its entrance half hidden in a mess's shadow. Tori stepped inside, pausing to marvel at the impressive method used to open up the area. Unlike her, Beverly had torn through rock rather than moving sand, as the scattered remains of rubble and deep claw marks through the cave attested. It culminated in a far more intimidating, but also vastly smaller, space. Taking up a fair chunk of the limited room inside was a metal case identical to the one Tori had found in her own cavern, tucked carefully away lest anyone wandering by should notice its existence. "Looks like we had the same idea," Tori remarked as she surveyed the surroundings. "I dug out a big hole in a place like this not too far away. Mine was a bit larger, though, so if you wanted to sleep in shifts tonight, we could stay there." "I'll think about it." Beverly had clearly warmed to the idea of taking on robots with Tori's help, but it seemed outright trust was still a point yet to be crossed. Tori could hardly blame Beverly for the wariness. Part of her wondered if reaching out like this would culminate in getting stabbed in the back. If so, then there wasn't much to be done about it. Succeeding in this environment was going to require risk, that was obvious. She'd either have to take heavy chances with strategy.
This route avoids a slowdown on I-405 North. You are on the fastest route. You'd reach your destination by 1756.
Her fellow apprentices, this way, at least, seemed moderately less likely to get her killed. Since Beverly still appeared on the fence, Tori decided that it was time for a show of good faith, or as close to one as she could manage under the circumstances. "Well, if you decide to take me up on it, at least I've got plenty of rations there. We wouldn't have to haul anything over from your cache." Meal bars and bottles of water weren't the world's best olive branch, but Beverly nodded in appreciation at the offer, so Tori counted it as a small victory. At least her fellow apprentice wouldn't think she was trying to mooch. "Oh, and I had a scroll of some sort in mine too. My powers have nothing to do with magic, so I didn't bother opening it, but if you can get some use out of it, then it's all yours." Are you sure about that?" Beverly's large eyes widened even further, visibly taken aback by the unexpected display of generosity. "Look, I'm not pretending to be a saint here. If I thought that thing would give me any kind of edge, I'd keep it for myself, but it's useless in my hands. Maybe even dangerous. Better I hand it off to the person I'm working with instead. At this point, giving you a leg up helps me too." Tori leaned slightly outside the small cave, scanning the area for any sign of movement that might indicate a robot attack. They'd run into a few copper cord ones on just the walk over. Pesky things seemed to be increasing by the hour. "It might not be useful for me, either. The amulet has been confusing enough to try and figure out." Beverly gestured to her neck, though whatever lay there was buried under the dark fabric of her apprentice costume. "But I'll take a look at it. Highly doubt it could make things much worse." Beverly walked over to her own metal box and undid the latch, flipping it open to reveal the remaining contents. She'd gone through more food and water than Tori had, which made sense since she couldn't spend half her time in the form of living energy, but Beverly didn't reach for any of the foodstuffs. Instead, she dug down to the bottom of the cache, eventually coming up with a small leather case. With a quick motion, she popped it open, and then held it out so Tori could get a good look inside. Mine didn't have a scroll, but it did have this stuff. Couldn't make heads or tails of what it was or how it was supposed to be used, though obviously it's some sort of high-tech toolbox. "Since we're pooling resources, you can have it, as long as you can use it." Tori suppressed her desire to drool as she stared at the array of instruments before her. Most of the assortment laid out in the leather box was familiar to her, things she had lower quality versions of in her own lab, but a few were new even to her. The only part that struck Tori as odd was that this was clearly a case meant for someone to tool around with advanced technology, yet the desert they were in was barren of materials. The whirring sound of a passing copper cord drone echoed across the landscape outside. Beverly checked over Tori's shoulder to make sure it wasn't getting close, her eyes already glowing their telltale green. For Tori, however, the sound was not the harbinger of battle about to commence. It was a wake-up call correcting the misassumption she'd made only seconds prior. There were, in fact, tons of raw materials out in the desert, provided one had the combat acumen to procure them. That drone and all its siblings were stuffed with all manner of electronics Tori could twist to her own designs. I think I can get some solid use out of those, Tori said at last, accepting the case and snapping it shut. Let's swing by my cave to drop this off and let you look at the scroll. After that, I want to get back into the field while we've still got daylight. If we work hard enough this afternoon, we may be able to kick the shit out of this place tomorrow. Sounds like you've got a plan, Beverly remarked. A coy, half-fanged smile danced on her lips as she remained partially shifted to her green dragon form. Calling it a plan seems a bit grandiose, it's more of an outline. But it all rests on laying the groundwork today. Tori slipped the case down to her side and peeked carefully out of the cave. So long as she was carrying those precious tools, shifting to fire form was out of the question. Given how little there is to do here, I'm going to take the wild guess that this groundwork centers on fighting robots, Beverly said. Tori shook her head then stepped back out into the sun's burning light. Not fighting. Hunting. There is a very key difference. You see, from here on out, we're going to use every part of the robot buffalo. Chapter 22. By the time evening fell, Tori and Beverly had managed to down 6 of the silver cord robots and a dozen or so more coppers. It was rough going at first as they gained a better sense of how to combat the spherical enemies as well as how to work together. During the first 2 battles, there were times when their attacks overlapped, each nearly striking the other. Those were tenuous, dangerous seconds during which their fragile alliance easily could have shattered. The need to win, however, drowned out any petty squabbling that might have occurred, and by the time their opponent was down, all thoughts of dissolution were driven from their minds. As the day wore on, coming closer and closer to dusk, their teamwork grew stronger. Each woman began to understand the other's natural attack style, and they soon fell into a rhythm. Tori darted in and out, zipping around to draw attention while Beverly charged in and smashed the most pivotal pieces of the robot's anatomy. By the time they killed their 6th silver cord robot, they were functioning like a well-calibrated machine themselves, tearing through the last opponent in only a few minutes. Much of a roll as they were on, neither wanted to press their luck as the sun began to set. Surprise was the element that had given them the most edge in their fights. With Tori standing out like a beacon against the dark sky, that aspect of battle would be turned against them. Better to hole up, rest, and conserve strength for the next day's fights. They made it back to Tori's cave just as the last specks of sunlight were fading from the horizon, covering the desert in a blanket of stars and darkness. It would have been an easier and faster trip, if not for the fact that Beverly was forced to spend it hauling most of the mechanical remains from one of their silver cord opponents across the desert. When they finally reached the cave, she set it carefully down outside, and then shifted from her green dragon form back to the lovely, weary young woman Tori had first met. Alright, that's 4 of the damn things. If you can't work with that, drag the next one yourself. Beverly made a show of stretching her back and arms, despite the fact that they weren't really all that tired. She was still learning about her dragon powers, but her green form seemed almost impervious to fatigue. Should be plenty, Tori assured her. With this much raw material, I think I can whip together a useful tool or 2 by sunrise. How about you? Going to take another crack at the scroll. Maybe after dinner. Beverly had already opened the scroll stuffed in Tori's cache, though there hadn't been any effect that they could discern. After a few minutes of study, Beverly came to the conclusion that whatever magic lay amid the arcane runes burned into the parchment would require some sort of activation. Since daylight had been dwindling, she put it away as a project to look at during her time on guard duty. With night upon them, both women turned their attention to fighting hunger and dehydration by downing most of the remaining supplies stashed in Tori's metal box. If they wanted to last another day in the desert, it would mean either relocating to Beverly's hideout or hauling over her supplies. Each could easily go without the food and water for a day if needed, but constant combat would take its toll unless they were properly sated. What's your deal anyway? Beverly asked as she dug into her 3rd meal bar. It seemed the slender woman either burned a lot of calories while in her dragon form or possessed the not-so-super ability of having a tapeworm. You've got a really cool ability where you turn into fire, but you want to spend the night tinkering around with busted robot parts. For a brief moment, Tori contemplated hiding her plans for the salvaged components, concealing her true abilities from this woman who might end up being her competition. That idea was quickly tossed aside, primarily because Beverly would quickly see Tori's talents when her devices were used, but also because lying seemed a poor choice. Ivan appeared to have a lot of friends in the guild. If Beverly made it to full member status along with her, Tori could use a few comrades of her own. That sort of relationship was built on trust, though, especially among villains. I'm actually more of a tech head than a fire user. Right now I'm working on a metasuit, and I've been inventing more or less since childhood. Truth be told, I really don't like using my powers this much, but Pseudonym wouldn't let me bring any of my gear. Living off the land seems to be the theme of this weekend. Well, sort of. Beverly took a long draw from a bottle of water, emptying it out and setting it aside. I guess I can see why you're supposed to be a big deal, though. Having those powers and the smarts to build your own tech. That's a hell of a combo. My teacher is the big deal, not me, Tori quickly corrected. And the only reason I got him was that no one else wanted me. My attitude is seen as problematic, tandem, cooperative, and other shit like that. I mean, I still think I'm awesome, but I doubt anyone else in the guild really believes that. Not yet, anyway. Thuggernold thinks pretty highly of Pseudonym, that's for sure. As strong as my teacher is, I get the feeling he's a little wowed by yours, Beverly said. He is something of a legend. Tori finished choking down her lone meal bar, the texture roughly akin to what she imagined eating styrofoam would be like. But tell me about Thuggernold, I've only gotten to meet him in passing. Is he really as strong as he looks? More, Beverly replied. That first night when I ran into Thuggernold, I thought I was going to kill him. After a couple weeks of training, I realized that the only thing holding him back was him trying not to seriously injure me.
Really?
I'm really lucky he took me on as an apprentice, otherwise I doubt I'd have even this much control over all this stuff. I don't mean to pry, and if this is overstepping, I understand, but I have to ask. Since you seem to view these powers as more burden than blessing, why not just take off the necklace? Wordlessly reaching up to the top of her costume, Beverly carefully undid a clasp and pulled the neckline open, exposing the top of her sternum. Her dark skin was smooth and flawless at first, but then a pattern began to glow with silver light. In moments the symbol, which ran up around her throat like a necklace, had lit the cave with a soft, candle-like glow. Nothing to take off. The moment I put the necklace on, it fused with me. Thuggernold's brought me to every person he trusts in the magic division, and none of them have any idea how to separate me from it. Like it or not, for now, I'm stuck with these powers. If I want any shot at my old life back, it means getting them under control. Tori nodded her head at the 3 torn-apart robots resting just outside the cave door. Seems to me you've got things pretty well in hand. Being the dragons is the easy part, it's keeping them at bay that's tough. Every time I get scared or mad or surprised, I can feel them pushing to get out. Beverly bowed her head. The intricate silver tattoo faded away, plunging them once more into darkness. I'm making progress, though. There was a time I couldn't even get it to disappear, which would have really cut down on my wardrobe options. Not to mention swimsuits would pretty much be out, unless you could dig out one of those giant frilly dress ones from the 30s, Tori added. Yeah, that shit was not happening. I don't do frills or ruffles, no exceptions. Beverly glanced out the opening of the cave, taking in the soft night sky. For what it's worth, I'm glad I ran into you today. This has been a lot easier with someone to watch my back. Imagine how we could have torn through this if everyone worked together, Tori replied. Wish in one hand, spit in the other. Beverly's eyes began to glow, this time scarlet instead of their usual emerald green. If you want to bed down, I can take first watch. My red dragon has solid night vision. Thanks, but I'd rather get to work. Tori stood from her sandy seat and walked over to the cave's rear where the case holding those precious tools was stashed. I've got too many ideas whizzing around in my head. Even if I wanted to sleep, I doubt the explosion was far enough off that neither woman thought they were under attack, though they did both react immediately to the threatening sound. Tori dropped the case, her body turning to flames before the metal even hit the soft, sandy floor of the cave. Beverly's body lengthened and grew, covered with bright red scales as she took on the only one of her forms Tori had yet to witness. Both peered out the narrow doorway for a few seconds, waiting for more explosions or the sound of approaching enemies. After a few minutes of peace, Beverly leaned out, sniffing the air carefully as she scanned the thick night. Eventually, she pulled herself back in and shed her inhuman form, an expression of worry draped across her face. There's a faint scent of smoke coming from the southwest, but it seems pretty far off. Nothing approaching, as far as I can tell. Best guess is that one of the boys decided to try and do a little night hunting to grab more cores. Let's hope so. Tori shifted from living fire to perfectly normal-looking young woman, although her brain was still shooting adrenaline through her system. Well, I wasn't anywhere near sleep before, and now it's definitely not happening. No kidding. Beverly's eyes still glowed with a faint red light as she made her way across the cave, lying down with her head against the rock wall at the rear, gazing directly out the entrance. I may stay up for a while and watch you work. Just until my nerves settle. Feel free, Tori told her. but fair warning, when I get in the zone, I'm not very chatty. Beverly reached out to the nearby metal box and plucked the scroll from its depths, carefully unrolling it between her narrow fingers. Somehow, I think I'll manage. Lance limped through the desert, only his myriad of insect helpers supporting him. His leg was probably broken. Enough high school football had taught him the basics of what such injuries felt like. He couldn't manage to put even the smallest amount of weight on the limb, so that was also a dead giveaway. The swarm of dragonflies and bees pushing upward on his left shoulder acted as a makeshift crutch, giving him what he only prayed would be enough mobility to complete his escape. All those sentries and scouts he'd positioned around the desert, and none had given Lance adequate warning. That robot had come after him like there was a target on his chest, turning so many of his conjured minions to ash under its laser blast. Those that survived served as a smokescreen to cover his escape, which was more falling off the top of a mesa than any daring plan to make himself scarce. Whatever that robot was, Lance knew from the moment it arrived that he wasn't going to be able to win the fight. The silver cord ones had been challenged enough. He'd had to practically choke their interior electronics with swarm after swarm of insect sacrifices to shut them down. This one didn't seem keen on letting anything get close, not even a seemingly harmless bug. Lance couldn't imagine how any of the 4 apprentices were going to be able to take it down. If the other 3 were that far out of his league that they could dispatch something that powerful solo, what was the point of making him train alongside them? Lance would have slowed down as the realization struck him, if he could have afforded to. Tori had been right from the beginning. They were supposed to work together. It was the only way any of them had even half a hope of stopping something that strong. Lance cursed himself for not listening, then turned his attention away from the mistake and on to what could still be done. Raising his right hand, Lance conjured a handful of assorted flying bugs and tossed them into the air. There was a day left yet. If he could find Tori or one of the others, maybe he could convince them to team up with him. True, he was injured, but his power had never been physically based in the first place. Even if they demanded some of his orbs in exchange for working together, it would be worth it. By Lance's reckoning, that robot he'd fought was either a gold or platinum core. If it was platinum, that was bad enough, but if it was gold, then they were in a world of shit. A gold core robot doing that much damage meant he hadn't even seen the final opponents, and with the way they seemed to exponentially grow in difficulty, Lance wasn't sure he'd survive a platinum encounter. With his bugs on the wind searching for those who might be allies, Lance focused on limping along as fast as he could, desperately searching for somewhere he could lie low until sunrise. Ivan sat in his living room, a glass of sweet tea in his hand as he watched the evening news. Beth was asleep upstairs, worn out from her long day, and Rick had snuck out his window only a half-hour prior. It was always tempting to bust his son when he clumsily tripped through wards and traps that would have incinerated him had they not been key to leave him alone, but Ivan resisted. He had, after all, once been that age, and the trouble he'd gotten into was far worse than anything Rick was likely to manage. Ivan followed him on occasion, staying to the shadows and keeping watch to make sure intervention wasn't needed. Usually, all Rick did was sneak over to a friend's house or to the parking lot of a local gas station where he would hang out with the same friends. All teenagers went through some form of rebellion. At least Rick's was largely harmless. Still, Ivan planned to catch him when he came home tonight. Rebellion had risks, and getting caught came with consequences. He couldn't stay on top of his son all the time, not if he wanted Rick to learn how to live on his own, but Ivan knew too well the problems that came for those without limits. Occasionally catching and grounding him would remind his son that there were rules in his life, curfew included, and breaking them still had consequences. A video of the daring rescue from a few days prior cycled across the television screen. The various news outlets had been playing the fight footage ad nauseum, no doubt at the Aussies' urging. While none of the old guard went in much for that sort of promotion, it was common knowledge that the founding 3 were getting more and more hands-off as time wore on. The media relations team was likely almost completely comprised of younger, more ambitious capes eager to make their organization seem like the gold standard in superpowered heroics. Technically, none of the original 3 needed to step away from their leading roles. Quorum's age was slowed down to a point where it was nearly irrelevant. Professor Quantum seemed to have found a way to permanently lock his appearance to that of a late 40-something, and Lodestar. Well, Ivan understood why she'd let her position in the organization diminish. Life was often cruel in its little tricks, offering gifts with price tags not understood until long after they'd been accepted. Not that she'd ever really been given a choice. Lodestar's power was thrust upon her. She wasn't like the hungry ones who'd sought it out. She wasn't like Ivan. Ivan's mind turned, as it had ceaselessly since the weekend's inception, back to his apprentice and the trial she was undergoing. Tori had been doing well when he left Salaz's room, having paired up with Beverly to fight the Silver Core robots. She was a smart woman and had made finding a place to hide top priority. There was little chance she'd be caught unaware once the gold cord machines were released, and even if she was, at least she had backup. Beverly seemed to be an exceptional meta herself, and Ivan had implicit trust in Thuggernot's guiding hand. The two of them together could likely overcome a goal just as they were, albeit not without some injuries. If they managed to make use of the supplemental supplies in their caches, they'd be able to pull it off without issue. Though, Ivan still planned to look in on them again tomorrow after Janet picked up the kids. It was simply good form for her teacher to be waiting when the trial was done, after all. Chapter 23. You know, in spite of the green scales and leathery skin, I'm not actually a purse, right? Beverly slung the makeshift sling and its bulky contents around her shoulder and fastened it in place as best she could. It still bounced and rustled when she moved, but at least it seemed to stay on her. I'd love to help out, but since neither the scroll nor the robot parts were made of morphing materials, they won't turn to fire with me. That means if I'm carrying, I either stay totally human, and therefore useless, or go into fire form and drop or burn everything I've got. To illustrate the point, Tori switched to the incarnation of living flame and ran her hand along the cave wall, leaving a scorch mark behind. Guess they gave you a uniform made of the morph stuff, Beverly said, taking note for the first time that Tori's clothes changed with her. Makes sense. Mine's made to shrink and expand as needed. Too bad it didn't come with a backpack. She adjusted the sling once more, and the two women stepped from the safety of their cave into the early morning sunlight. We going after more silvers today? Beverly asked, her eyes already beginning to shift into the white iris of her flying dragon form. Or whatever is out there. Given the explosions we heard last night, I wouldn't be surprised if someone fought their first gold. Maybe even platinum. Can't afford to fall behind. Especially not since we have to split our winnings. Beverly's skin lightened as scales appeared from its formerly smooth depths. I'll do the usual circle around, see what's visible, and then come back so we can start moving toward our target. Perfect. Meet you on top of that mesa. Tori pointed upward to one of the many patches of raised land surrounding them and then began to push off the ground using controlled blasts of flame. After discovering the new technique on the prior day, she'd become determined to get as much practice as possible while safely away from civilization. While flight didn't come as easily for her as it clearly did for Beverly, there was still a primal thrill in ignoring the limits of gravity and soaring, or carefully bobbing, through the air. One day, she'd make a meta-suit that would slice across the sky, but this would do until then. Beverly nodded, finishing the transformation. Her white dragon form was as large as the others, though in place of her arms, a pair of massive, leathery wings extended from her torso. With one kick from her mighty hind legs, she leapt into the sky, quickly pulling herself higher with a few powerful flaps. In seconds, she'd risen high enough that Tori had trouble distinguishing her fellow apprentice from the white clouds. Turning her attention to her own ascent, Tori slowly rose upward toward the predetermined mesa, so intent on keeping stabilized that she didn't even notice the wasp, clearly not indigenous to the area, that buzzed by and abruptly stopped as soon as it saw her. He'd found her. Not just a fellow apprentice, which would have been good enough, but the only one to advocate working together. She was some ways out, it would take him an hour or so to reach her, but at least he had a location. The wasp would stay on her, and he could adjust his course as she moved. While there was no denying this was a long shot, it was still a shot. And he'd take what he could get. Poking his head out from under the shelf of rock where he'd taken cover, Lance slowly pulled himself up from the dirt. His leg hurt even more than it had last night, and the rest of his body had begun to add its own lyrics to the symphony of pain. Taking that kind of tumble, even with his swarm to slow his fall, had left Lance with more injuries than he'd realized. It was an important issue, one that warranted dealing with. Something he fully intended to do as soon as the trial was over. Until then, he would soldier on. If anything, it would just make his eventual triumph all the more impressive. The thought of coming out on top in spite of his bruised and battered body was all that gave Lance the strength to push himself forward. The crutch of bugs was back in place, its individual denizens more numerous than before thanks to a few hours of summoning under the cover of night. Lance hobbled forward, cutting a brisker pace than the day before, eyes set on the sunrise. Soon he'd reach Tori and hopefully be able to make a case for teaming up. If he was lucky, she'd have seen the robot he fought already. That thing made the case all on its own. Either way, he'd feel better once he wasn't out in the open alone. Lance just had to hope the robot didn't find him before then. Tori barely made it onto the mesa before she heard a roar rip through the sky. Glancing upward, she caught sight of Beverly tucked into a dive, careening toward the mesa at breakneck speed. There was a moment of total, unmediated confusion as she watched her partner on what seemed like a death dive for no reason. Then, from behind the cover of a cloud, the robot came into view. It was smaller than the silver court ones, but slightly larger than Beverly in her current form. Unlike the others, however, this one was human-shaped. As Tori watched, it raised its right hand at the fleeing dragon, releasing a bolt of red energy directly at her. Beverly, operating on what had to be sheer instinct by this point, tucked her wings and rolled, avoiding the blast by mere inches. The red bolt tore through a nearby mesa, causing a massive explosion and showering the whole area in fragments of broken rock. That was a hell of a weapon. This was no non-lethal armament like the silver sonic cannon. It was meant to kill, albeit messily. And if that's the tool it was opening with, Tori had to assume there was more powerful gear stashed away in its metal body. Beverly skidded to a stop on top of the mesa, her powerful claws leaving deep grooves in the rock as she killed the momentum from her dive. Before she'd even fully stopped, her scales began changing from pearly white to an emerald green, wings vanishing in exchange for thick, muscular arms. Reaching up with one newly altered appendage, Beverly sliced through the knot on the makeshift sling, sending it tumbling to the ground with a rattling thud. Swiveling her reptilian head toward Tori, Beverly spoke, the first time she'd done so in a dragon form since they met. "It's strong." Beverly's voice was harsh and rough, like a rattlesnake who'd managed to evolve vocal cords. "I can see that." Tori watched the robot descend, both of its arms raised and ready to fire, no doubt waiting for the opportune shot. "Can you buy me enough time to use my gun?" "Use it fast." She whipped her head back around, keeping a watchful eye on the robot as it landed across the mesa, its arms still raised. Without another word, the green dragon woman barreled forward, racing toward the mechanical opponent that had chased her out of the sky. Before she'd even made it 3 steps, the robot fired off a bolt of focused blue energy from its left hand that crackled as it cut through the air. Beverly wasn't entirely able to get out of this one's way, and she roared in pain as it burned through part of her bicep. As much as it hurt, she kept right on barreling forward, refusing to be stopped so easily. Green blood dripped from her arm as she rushed to close the gap. While Beverly charged, Tori shifted back to human form and hurriedly dug through the sling on the ground. During her evening of turning salvaged parts into workable electronics, Tori had imagined the adversary she might use her inventions on when the sun rose. In her mind, though, the situation hadn't been quite so desperate, nor had it come so soon. But what her imagination had failed to anticipate in terms of setting, it had certainly accounted for regarding necessary power. Jerking her invention free of the sling, Tori turned just in time to see Beverly getting into range for a melee attack. As the powerful green monster tore across the mesa's rock surface, the metallic humanoid watched her come. It squeezed off one more blue energy shot, which Beverly managed to dodge. It quickly became clear that this was not a fight that would take place over a long range. Beverly fully intended to use those powerful claws and muscles against the robot's comparatively slender form. Just as she was one step away from paying back the damage she'd taken, her metallic opponent leapt upward, taking flight and putting itself completely out of her range. "Right idea," Tori muttered, carefully drawing a bead on her now floating target. "Wrong opponents." She pulled the barely fastened trigger, and the entire apparatus she had braced against her shoulder began to vibrate. With enough time and parts, she could have built in stabilizers to get rid of the device's shaking, but those were luxuries not afforded to her. Instead, Tori grit her teeth and kept her aim, refusing to lose this chance. There was no guarantee they'd get another. The reason Tori had wanted to go after the silver core robots wasn't just because of their size. She'd wanted a sonic cannon of her own from the instant one knocked her all the way back to being human. Of course, the ones inside the bots were too big for her to carry, let alone wield. That was why she'd spent the night piecing together a version that was smaller, light enough that even she could utilize it. Of course, with a bit of ingenuity and 4 robots worth of parts to work with, Tori had done more than just shrink the cannons. She'd also cranked up their output. As the sonic blast tore through the air, a massive wall of vibration that slammed into the floating robot as it took aim at the dragon below, Tori was glad she'd given it all the stopping power she could. Even as their opponent seemed to lose control and fell toward the mesa once more, she didn't trust it. She wouldn't until the thing was torn into pieces and scattered through the sand. "Beverly." Tori's shout was all her partner needed. The dragon woman was already reared back and ready to jump. The moment Tori screamed, Beverly leapt, meeting the humanoid in midair with an audible crunch. Her claws were tearing through its torso and her powerful jaws were crushing through its left shoulder before they even hit the ground. Whether this was payback or pragmatism was up for debate, but there could be no doubt it was effective. The two slammed into the rocky top of the mesa, sending a spray of dust and rock everywhere. While the adversaries fought, Tori dug through the sling once again. She pulled the smoking circuit board out of her makeshift sonic cannon and threw it to the ground. Overclocking the device came with a serious drawback. The internal system got fried after every shot. Since she had 4 robots to salvage from, she only had 4 chances to fire her cannon. Well, 3, now. Slamming the second circuit board into position, Tori quickly aimed at the dissipating cloud of dust. firing into the fray was only going to be a last-ditch effort. Large as the blasts were, she definitely hit Beverly if another shot was needed, but that would be a far better fate for her than taking one of the robot's explosive shots at point-blank range. A wave of relief washed over Tori as the dust finally fell away to reveal Beverly, still in her green dragon form, standing over what looked more like an appended bin of spare parts than the remains of an actual robot. In her claw, shining bright in the mid-morning sun, was a golden orb the same size as the lesser ones they'd already collected. Tori lowered her gun back to the ground and made her way across the mesa, intent on checking out the remains for herself. You didn't leave me much to work with, did you? A few rogue sparks still crackled from the debris that had only moments ago been a deadly opponent, but there was little chance of it suddenly springing back to life and attacking them. Not unless it was built to self-repair or was actually made of far tinier robots all working together. All that sonic blast did was stun it. Bastard was already getting its shit together when I attacked. Decided not to take any chances. Beverly's voice had lost its husky quality. Tori glanced over and found herself staring at the human version of her fellow apprentice, no worse for the wear despite her injuries. Do you need me to look at your arm? Tori offered. It's fine. Beverly pulled back her sleeve to show a bare, unmarked bicep. I told you, my green dragon is tough and can heal like nobody's business. I'm just glad he didn't get off another one of those red explosion shots while I was coming at him. I'll have to look it over to be sure, but I'd wager it didn't because it couldn't. Attacks that strong take a lot of juice. It probably needed to recharge after the first shot. Tori hunkered down in a squat and began sifting through the claw and tooth-marked remains. There's other stuff in here, too. Shield system that it didn't get to use thanks to the cannon, smaller weapons, even a few for melee. Keep watch while I pick through this. Think you'll find something you can use? Beverly asked. Tori shook her head. Even if there'd been time, Beverly had done too good a job turning her opponent into scrap. Nothing physical, but if I'm lucky, I might see what little tricks this one was hiding. That way the next one won't take us by surprise. Take your time, then. Beverly's eyes began to glow white as scales manifested over her body. There's bound to be a lot of those out there. I'd like to see how many we can take down. And first kill on the golds goes to Thuggernut's apprentice, with pseudonyms getting a respectable assist, Johnny announced. While he was still wearing a pinstripe suit, it was at least a different one than the day before. An assist. What fight were you watching? Zalaz made a motion to the wall. One of the screens began to rewind until it was showing Tori's blast once more. Without that shot, Dragon Girl had no chance of making the hit. If anything, Tori got the kill and Beverly got the assist. Tori's contribution was invaluable, that's why she gets an assist. Johnny pulled out the laptop he'd brought along and made a few quick keystrokes, updating the betting pool along with how much he stood to make himself. This was a big one. Almost no one had picked Beverly for the first kill of a gold cord. The one who spills the blood, or in this case circuits, gets the credit. You know it as well as I do. Johnny is right, Gork said. Her voice was nearly as rough as her words were heavy. Gork's people had a heavy emphasis on honor and protocol, which made her quite a stickler for the rules. Or at least the one she agreed to follow. When it came to matters of fairness, regarding both the letter and spirit of their rules, Gork was universally considered as impartial a judge as could be found in a guild full of criminals and outlaws. Had the Aussie greeted Gork as a friend instead of assuming her people were a threat, they might have gained powerful allies beneath the Earth's crust. Unfortunately, force had won over diplomacy, and Gork's culture had very firm ideas about dealing with unwarranted aggression. See, from the part rock woman's mouth herself. Finishing his entry, Johnny slid the laptop back into the bag by his feet and turned his attention to the screens once more. That said, it was one hell of an assist. Can't believe the gal put together something like that out of spare parts in a single night. I'm starting to see why she's so insistent on being in Wade's department, Zalaz agreed. I've got a few upgrades in mind I've been tinkering with, might have to see if she has any thoughts worth sharing. No loading the rookies with too much work until they actually become full members, Gork reminded her. Zalaz crossed her arms and frowned, an exaggerated gesture that set off red lights around her cheeks. Stop trying to rain on all my fun. First you break up a me and Johnny fight, now you tell me I can't use an apprentice for grunt work. I just said you had to wait to do that, Gork pointed out. If you can't be more creative in your hazing, then you really don't deserve to mess with them anyway. This is you we're talking about. Ouch, foiled by my own reputation. Fine. I'll find more ways to amuse myself at their expense, Zalaz conceded. I plan to take it easy on Pseudonym and Thuggernut's kids, though. They seem the type to want payback, and are a little more competent than I prefer my victims. Beverly definitely is, Thuggernook confirmed. While I don't know Tori that well, she has survived as Pseudonym's apprentice for nearly a month. Zalaz looked back at the screen where Tori was pulling apart one of the larger pieces of the robot's chest, trying to crack open an undamaged section of its electronics. Let's hope he wasn't going easy on her. There's still daylight left before this thing is done. Chapter 24. Warren slid his back along the rocky wall separating him from the hovering, human-shaped robot currently scanning for his location. The symbol he'd drawn on his torso cloaked him from most of its sensors, at least, he hoped so, but the spell wasn't strong enough to keep him safe if the thing caught sight of him. He'd been overconfident. Taking down a half-dozen silvers on his own had bolstered Warren's opinion of his abilities, and he'd gone up against the new opponent without enough research. To say that had backfired would be like saying Fornax had been mildly disliked by the local police during his heyday. As it was, Warren desperately needed to escape, regroup, and strategize. Despite the wounds on his legs and the blood dripping from his chest, Warren still believed he could win against what he assumed was a gold-cored robot. But it would require planning, preparation, and time to heal, none of which he was likely to have if that thing caught hold of him. Ballum had made it clear, this was not a gentle trial. No one was waiting in the wings to leap in and save him. It was just as it was in the real world, to fail was to die. And Warren didn't intend to die. Not in this robot-infested desert, not for failing to impress the guild, not under Ballum's heel for not living up to his expectations. Warren would survive. It was what he did. What he had always done. The only difference now was that the stakes were higher. That, and the fact that Warren finally had some power of his own to swing around. Dipping his finger into one of the many wounds torn open by rock debris from the explosion, he began to scrawl a new symbol on the wall behind him. It took a few more dips in the leg wound to get enough blood, but eventually, he finished his work. He pressed his hand to the symbol and it immediately began to glow, just as the matching one he'd scrawled days before did. That symbol resided on a small outcropping between two messes over a mile away, sheltered from elements and sight. When the glow faded, Warren was no longer anywhere near the robot that had attacked him. The symbol, its work completed, crumbled into dust that caught on the late morning breeze. Seconds after he vanished, the only proof Warren had ever been standing there at all was the small pool of blood drying in the sand. Hunting the golds was much different than going after the silvers. Silver-cored robots, formidable as they were, excelled in a castle-style defense. They were big and well-armored but suffered from poor mobility. Golds took an opposite approach. They zipped through the sky as they searched for targets, preferably ones they could catch unaware. In a way, their technique was similar to the copper-cored drones from the first day, though those were obviously far easier to handle. This meant that Beverly couldn't fly around scanning from a safe distance for targets like they'd done for the silvers. Going airborne now came with serious risks. Since it would make her vulnerable in one of her weaker forms, the women quickly brushed aside the idea of having Beverly do any more solo air scouting. Instead, they decided to use the fact that they were being hunted to their advantage. Beverly waited patiently atop a mesa in her red dragon form, scanning the sky for any flying enemies. When one was spotted, she would let loose a blast of flame in its direction. These attacks were, of course, much too far away to be effective, but they succeeded in their true purpose of drawing the robot's attention to her. As it would get close, the gold cord would take a few shots at Beverly, who would immediately shift to her green form. At such a long range, he was easily able to dodge any attacks, even the red blasts. This helped them to gain some critical information. Tori had correctly assumed that the red blasts needed to be recharged after firing. Finding its tactics ineffective, the robot would then drop height, seeking to shorten the range of the shots and remove Beverly's ability to dodge. That was when Tori took her shot, blasting it from her hidden nearby position with a sonic cannon. With its shields down since it thought it was safe, the robot was stunned long enough for Beverly to attack, shredding it to pieces just as she had the first. Their first attempt at using the strategy was rough. Tori nearly missed due to the robot's last-minute shift, and Beverly wasn't quite quick enough off the line. The robot had nearly regained its senses by the time she arrived, which made for a tense moment as she attacked, uncertain whether her opponent would be able to activate its defenses in time. Luck was on their side, though, and the metallic enemy dropped to the ground as mere scrap metal under Beverly's assault. The second attempt went much more smoothly. The poor robot never even had a chance. 3 cores down. Beverly pulled the golden orb from the scattered electrical remains, her claws and glowing eyes the only remains of the dragon form she'd shed moments prior. That's 1,500 apiece. Not too shabby for a long weekend of work. You're counting wrong. Tori yanked the circuit board free as she walked over, dropping it to the ground like the trash it now was and pulling out their last functioning unit. Since killing this many means we'll win, one of us should turn in all the cores, getting the bonus. That turns $3,000 into $4,500, netting us $2,250 apiece, plus some extra from the silvers. Beverly stared carefully at the half-distracted woman as she tucked the orb away in her pocket with the others. Their partnership had worked out well so far, but they'd yet to reach the point that would truly test it. When money and credit were on the line, there was always the chance that one of them would decide alliances were worth less than what could be won. And which of us would do the claiming? Since you obviously think I'm doing this as some sort of trick, why don't you turn them in? Tori suggested as she loaded the final board into place. One shot left on the sonic cannon, and since they hadn't seen many silvers out since the prior night, it was best not to expect any chances at reloading. You trust me to just give you your cut. Not to mention giving up all the credit for these kills. Trust me, the guild knows exactly who killed what. They've probably watched everything we've done since arrival. The only people who would think more of me for turning in a bunch of orbs are you three, and I think there are already enough expectations being thrown my way as it is. Tori set her cannon down before turning to face Beverly properly. And yes, I will trust you with collecting the money. Best case scenario, you and I build a little more trust between us, something that is very useful to have in this place. Worst case scenario, you betray me and I learn you're not to be trusted. $2,000 isn't a cheap lesson, but better I learn it now before it costs me far more down the road. Stepping away from the robotic wreckage, Beverly shook her head and let out a muted chuckle. Jesus Christ, it's kind of creepy how logical you are. Sure you aren't part Vulcan. Nah, Spock wasn't that big on revenge. I'd definitely make you pay for screwing me over. But I don't really think it's going to come to that, Tori said. This place is already weird and scary enough. Last thing I need is someone with a grudge against me. Especially when that person could be an ally instead. Beverly stuck out her hand and Tori grasped it, giving a firm shake. I like to think we could even make it all the way to becoming friends, Tori added. From what I've seen, having those is half of what it takes to survive in this guild. In that case, I suspect you're about to find my proposal very interesting. This voice came from neither Beverly nor Tori. Both spun toward its source, Tori's whole body immediately morphing into living flame while green scales engulfed Beverly's form. What met their eyes was not a threat, or at least not something that seemed particularly threatening. Lance sat on the edge of the mesa, hands high in the air in a motion of clear surrender, a swarm of bugs helping keep him balanced as he rested. I come in peace. Is that Star Trek? Damn it, I knew I should have watched those shows. Point is, I don't want trouble. I came to talk about working together. Tori slowly lowered her hands and the fireballs burning ever ready in her palms, though she didn't turn back to her human form just yet. Taking in the man before her, she noted that his leg looked to be in rough shape, and he had the weary, hungered appearance of someone fighting sleep deprivation and dehydration. You barely look like you can sit up straight, meanwhile, we're taking out golds with ease. Feels less like you want to talk about teaming up and more like us dragging you along. True, I'm far from in peak condition, but my power has never been one that required me to do much dirty work. Besides, from the number of circuit boards left and what I saw through my bugs, I guess that fancy shooter of yours is on its last bullet, so you'll have to change strategies soon. I can lend a hand with that on the combat side, or at least my bugs can. And on top of that, I bring something to the table that neither of you has, surveillance and tracking. Imagine if you knew where those gold core robots were at any given time. Might make getting around and hunting them a lot easier. He talks a good game, Beverly said, words a half snarl through her scaly snout. But how do we know he can back it up? A single wasp flitted through the air, rising from Beverly's back and floating until it landed on Lance's outstretched finger. He smiled as the realization dawned on the others and considered letting the moment speak for itself, but ultimately decided to really drive the point home. I found you, didn't I? Tori slowly shifted back to her human form, then walked over and picked up the sonic cannon. While she didn't actually point it at him, the implied threat was more than enough. Tori didn't need words to drive her points home, not when they were better used for making her demands. All right, Lance, tell us what you're thinking. Beth, don't forget your phone charger. Ivan's voice echoed up the hall into what he only hoped would be his daughter's room and mind. Well-intentioned though she was, Beth couldn't seem to keep track of her chargers no matter what lengths he and Janet went to. Were she a more malicious child, he'd have suspected the losses were intentional simply because he couldn't fathom one person genuinely going through so many. The upstairs bustled as the sounds of packing filled the air. It often seemed like his children had barely arrived before they were stuffing their lives back into suitcases and heading out the door. During those moments, Ivan had to force himself to remember how lucky he was to have even the weekends he did. After all, it wasn't as though Janet didn't have good cause to dispute the joint custody. He liked to think it was respect for his parenting abilities that kept her from trying to keep his children away, but in his heart of hearts, Ivan always suspected that fear was her primary motivator. While he would never hurt his children by taking away their mother, Janet likely still believed that crossing him so severely would be bad for her health. Sometimes, it was hard to remember the harsh, worried woman as the wild girl who'd had a thing for bad boys. Time had changed her, as it had him, and as it did all, eventually. There were many moments in Ivan's life he'd have altered given the chance, but his time with Janet was certainly not among them. Not for fond memories of her, which a bad marriage and worse divorce had soured. No, Ivan wouldn't dare risk changing the past because it might steal from him two of the only things in the world he truly cared about. Rick came bustling down the stairs, bag slung over his shoulder, phone conspicuously absent from his hand. His and Ivan's discussion the prior night had been a long one, heavy on responsibility and trust, and while it ended with a grounding, such was done more in service to formal rule observation than out of anger. Ivan wanted his son to understand the importance of consequences. It was a lesson his life would have been better served if he'd learned it earlier. As the young man, the near-spitting image of Ivan at that age, son a few scars and pounds of muscle, reached the end of the stairs, he looked up at his father with a touch of embarrassment. "Dad, I just wanted to say I'm sorry again about last night. We went over everything, and it's fine. You know what you did wrong, and you're paying for it. So long as the lesson is learned, there's no need to keep breaking yourself over the coals." Ivan grabbed his son and wrapped the boy in a powerful hug. "Just don't go thinking you can slip past your old man so easily. Trust me, I've got that figured out." Rick hugged back, even though they both knew it was only a matter of time before he tried something again. This was the age where he tested his limits. Few people in the world understood that better than Ivan. "Dad, have you seen my charger?" The voice carried down from upstairs, causing Ivan to wince while in mid-hug. He glanced down at Rick, who quickly shook his head to the negative. Wordlessly, he reached into a drawer on the desk resting at the foyer's edge and removed one of a half-dozen identical white cords with specialized ends. "It's down here." Ivan called upstairs. He pressed a finger to his lips and stared pointedly at Rick, who took the message. "You left it on the kitchen counter." The goal was not to teach his son not to lie, but that lies were tools best used for purposes that suited them. Keeping a young girl from worrying over the loss of yet another cord, for example, was an excellent use of a well-timed lie. As was what he told them both he planned to spend the evening doing, reading, and getting a jump on the next day's work. No good would come of his children knowing he was off to check in on his apprentice in a guild of villains. It would only pointlessly change the way they looked at him, seeing a vision of who had been rather than who he was. After all, it was no lie that Fornax was dead. He passed away the moment he was pulled from his cell and shown the picture of the newborn baby bearing his DNA. From that moment on, only Ivan had remained. Chapter 25. The afternoon sun sank further toward the horizon as Beverly finished clawing her way through their fourth gold cord robot. At this point it was almost easy. Despite his injuries, Lance hadn't been bluffing about his ability to keep summoning and controlling bugs. Not only had this been helpful in scouting, hunting had also become much easier with his ability to send clouds of bugs as bait to draw their adversaries in. After a quick run to the cave for some supplies to at least bring him halfway back to life, the young man had sent scouts across the sky in search of more robots. Shortly thereafter, a gold cord arrived to take them down. Tori ambushed the robot in fire form alongside a green dragon Beverly. Their mechanical opponent barely had the chance to throw up an energy shield that hissed and crackled as Beverly's claws cut through it. Her hands were bloody as it fell to the ground, but by the time the robot was in pieces, her wounds had healed. It seemed the green dragon really could take quite a bit of punishment. "And this Nick's for?" Tori pointed to the gold cord, which Beverly quickly scooped up, using her claws like pincers and slipping it into the pouch on her expanded uniform. "Though, Lance, you're only getting a third of the ones you helped bring down. Tell you what, why don't you just go ahead and keep my share too?" Lance said. He pulled himself slowly up from behind the rocks where he'd been hiding, his swarm replaced by an actual crutch Tori had fastened out of leftover parts from their salvaged silver cord parts. "You helped us destroy it," Tori reminded him. "Sure, but you helped bandage my leg and gave me food and water. Never a good idea to overextend one's position in a deal. I'm lending aid as thanks for you two helping me survive this long, and hopefully until the end of the trial." Lance looked up at the dipping sun, taking in the splendor as its light danced across the mesas. "And seeing how much assistance I'll need getting back, let's just say I feel more comfortable trading my help for yours rather than getting greedy." "He's smarter than he looks," Beverly noted, the last of her dragon self slipping away. "To be fair, given my size and appearance, that's a pretty low bar." Lance shrugged his muscular shoulders and smiled with the sort of willful innocence that really had no place on an apprentice of the Villains Guild. But I am smart enough to know we're starting to get near the end of our time. We can try and hunt one more if you want, though I'd be surprised if getting back is really going to be as easy as just walking over. 4 golds are enough for me, Tori said, turning her fiery head to Beverly, who nodded as well. Plenty enough to win, especially the way we're doing it. I'm all for playing it smart and getting back to the meeting point. To illustrate the point, she shifted back to her green dragon form and walked over to Lance, lifting him from the ground as if he weighed no more than a few pounds and cradling him in her massive arms. Win or lose, I cannot imagine Arachnobro isn't going to give me shit for this, Lance sighed from the crook of Beverly's arm. Still beats not coming back at all, though. You can say that again. Tori turned back to full human form, something she'd tried to avoid any more than necessary around Lance, and pushed aside a small set of rocks near the wall where she'd stashed her cannon. Turning it over carefully in her hands, she slowly made her way back across the mesa and held it out to Lance. Here, I want you to hold this. Isn't that what the sling is for? Lance pointed to the twisted fabric around Beverly's back, now largely empty except for the lone scroll resting inside. She can't carry us both, and I can't hold this when I'm in flame mode. If something gets the jump on us, you can still shoot, so you get tasked with holding it. Just remember, you only have one shot, and if you use it on either of us, the other will make you regret it. Tori shook the cannon once, moving it a few inches closer to the injured man in the dragon's arms. Trust me, there is no gain in me taking a shot at either of you. But if something attacks, I'll be ready. Lance reached out and wrapped a meaty hand around the cannon, clutching it carefully against his pecs. Good. And don't miss. Like I said, one shot left, Tori reminded him. Think there will be trouble. Beverly growled. Look at who we're dealing with. The question isn't if there will be trouble, it's how much we're about to step into. Tori's form grew blurry as she once more morphed to flame, then pushed herself gently into the air with her controlled blasts. Lance, keep your bugs on alert. I'll try and scout as best I can. Beverly, if we get caught off guard, scatter first, then regroup. Let's finish strong. Beverly's gravelly voice echoed off the messes as the 3 apprentices started on the final leg of their trial, the journey back to the start. The platinum timer ticked away steadily, shedding seconds as the time for the final confrontation drew closer. In Zalaz's room, the cheerful atmosphere had subsided significantly as each spectator watched the screens with more rapt attention than they had before. As veteran members of the guild, they knew that everything in the previous few days had merely been sport and spectacle, a way to test the mettle of each apprentice as well as entertain the watching guild. What was coming was the true test, their actual trial. Of everyone present, no one was more nervous than Thuggernaut. While the others had met and enjoyed some of the rookies one-on-one, he was the only person present with a vested interest in seeing one make it back alive. Beverly was strong and had a good head on her shoulders, but she was still green. He could only hope that the last few days were enough to teach her that she wasn't invincible. If she didn't think through what was about to happen, it could cost her more than spare change and bragging rights. As he watched worriedly, Johnny laid a hand on the massive man's shoulder. Relax. She's a good one, and Ivan's kid has solid instincts. Add in that they've got the insect guy's powers, and those 3 have a real shot at making it. We've seen others with shots make bad choices, Thuggernaut replied, eyes unwavering from the screen. Maybe so, but none of them had you as a teacher. You know Beverly better than anyone here, and I've got no doubt you prepped her for this as much as you could. Now it's time to have some faith. Johnny leaned forward, nodding to the ticking clock with highlighted platinum numbers. They can do it. And hey, you'll win a few bucks in the process. There's that classic Johnny way of navigating a moment, Zalaz said. But he's right. Those 2 are kicking ass, and adding in Lance only makes the group stronger. If anyone should be crapping themselves right now, it's Ballum. His apprentice hasn't exactly been going strong since the golds came out. Warren got one, Gork reminded them. He'd managed it after a morning of recovery, and while the effort was impressive, especially since he'd